Right, welcome back. Where are we in this fourth week in the series? We're talking to you about the environment, and the environment we know has parts to it, and those parts are the general environment and the task environment. And we've spoken to you about the task environment and the components of the task environment, and it's now time to start talking to you about the general environment. So let me go back up there into the corner of the screen and do exactly that. You're familiar with this. You're familiar with the way I built it up from the inside, saying that there's an organization next door to a whole lot of other organizations, but that organization has an immediate or task environment. And then it also has to think about what's happening in the general environment in this green space beyond it. So I hinted to you in the previous lesson that that was something we could summarize as pest forces: political, economic, social, and technological. Some people will add ecological to that and legal, but my feeling has always been that pest forces as a mnemonic, an aid to the memory, is probably enough. So political, economic, social, technological, pest forces. Now, economic forces, because we have to define these things for you, economic forces are things like this. How much money there is in the economy, how much money people have to spend. It's obviously related to social forces, and we'll come back to that. But we're saying that it's the financial well-being of the nation is the thing we're interested in. The T in pest or technology is about is about what's transpiring. So we interested in two things here, I think, as university teachers and students. We're interested in artificial intelligence because we can find that useful to gain information and also do some writing assistance for us. And we're interested in Zoom because that, in fact, is the platform that I'm using to record this video lesson for you before I load it onto yet another platform, YouTube. So Zoom is something which has grown dramatically rapidly. The company didn't come into being yesterday. It existed before the COVID pandemic. And when we draw a picture of the growth, we recognize that while the business introduced in 2020, when we all shut down in March of 2020, Zoom grew very, very quickly as a means, as an application, as an intermediary between anyone who needed to talk to anyone else. So when we graph this, we say, oh, that doesn't look good. So over time, from here on the left-hand side of your screen to the right-hand side of your screen, we're saying things just got really, really bad. And this graph ends in Q3 of 2022, and the growth had declined to almost nothing. Now, let me add something. This doesn't mean that the company was doing badly. It doesn't mean that at all. It means that in 2022, in Q3, the company's growth in sales or revenue had declined, and that was simply because it had made Zoom available to as many people as were going to need it in a hurry. Now, that's no surprise or issue, and I don't think therefore a big deal. But let me show you this graph, which I think is even more interesting. And this makes the same headline, and it says that after the pandemic, that the growth slowed to a crawl, and it has. I mean, it was only growing by 3%. And you see here 2024, we'll come back to it in a second, and it grew by 55% and by 326%. Let's just create a bit of perspective. So I'm going to sketch a line on the screen for you, and I'm going to draw it right there, draw your attention to the fine print. When we say 2024, we are in effect saying the 12 months ending on the 31st of January 2024. In much the same way, the 12 months ended 31 January 2021 represent the 1st of February 2020. And we know that it was roughly about the middle of March 2020 where we all realized we had to go home because the government made us. And we stayed at home, and it was a terrible way to meet people because we weren't allowed outside. Remember, this is before we were allowed out into shopping centers and allowed to interact as long as we were wearing masks and remaining 6 feet away from each other, or 1.5 meters. So Zoom has grown dramatically. That's political forces, economic forces, technological forces, social forces. Let's talk about social forces. South Africa is a bit of a unique one. And every day I get a feed on my phone which tells me whether there are protests in KwaZulu-Natal or not. We have up to 15,000 community protests every year in this country. And that's not the only socio-cultural force, because there's also some sort of pushback, for example, from communities who are unhappy with mining, as we find in KwaZulu-Natal, in what is possibly the second most poor province or district municipality rather of our province, Mkanyakure, is a district under attack because of the coal which lies under the surface of the earth. And that threatens not only communities, but also wildlife preservation in terms of ecological balance. Doesn't stop there. An unpleasant one in the country is gender-based violence. And we move on and we talk about social structure. And social structure is something we must recognize as being the distinctions between people who are poor and people who are rich. In Sweden, there aren't marked differences, as I've written there, but in South Africa, they are rather great. We are a very disparate nation. So I went and found a picture for you to show you that we can start dividing people in different ways. We can talk on the left-hand side of the screen here about poor people and middle-class people and elites, as we've now started to call them. And something that happens as a consequence of being poor or middle classes or elite is that if you are elite and your fortunes change and you start finding things harder, it's actually not as bad for you, is it? Because there's a long way to go before you are dirt poor. But if you are dirt poor, or as we call transient poor or chronic poor, if this is your lot in life, then we're saying that you are constantly at risk. Hence this solid line over here. You're constantly at, oh, I beg your pardon. Let me just head back to that picture. You're constantly at risk of becoming worse off if you are above that line. Now, something that textbooks will address with you also is this notion of there being national cultures. I've spoken to you about it. National cultures are the way that people think and behave. And I'm going to say, do we know how South Africans think and behave? Because how we think and behave is a function of our values and what we hold dear, and not just our values and what we hold dear, but how we behave with respect to those values. Part and parcel of that, and I'm recognizing again that you will have stopped this video to write those things down for yourself. Part and parcel of this is just the nature of our population group. I'm speaking to you very probably as an 18 or 19 or maybe 20-year-old. And that means you are part of a very large community of young people. Japan, on the other hand, has a population pyramid, as we call them, which reflects that there are not so many young people. And and I've got a graph here of 3 countries for you. We're looking at the distinction between Nigeria and South Africa and Japan. And Nigeria is a very extreme illustration of a population pyramid between males on the one side and females on the other. South African population growth has slowed down. But what we find in Japan is that there are very few young people, and that is a very big distinction compared to what you see in Nigeria. So what will that mean? There are some people who say, well, it can only mean good things because we call it a dividend, a demographic dividend. I'm not inclined to believe that, because my concern is that if those people at the bottom end of a pyramid don't have any skills to offer to a job market, then they're not going to be able to make contributions to the economy. If there aren't jobs available, if we are not crafting businesses which create job opportunities, then all we're going to have is a very large population of young people who are angry at not being able to find work and live their best lives. So let's move on from that depressing talk and simply address with you the notion of political and legal forces. And this is indication of the fact that there are laws governing how we interact and how we trade across the face of the earth, in a pattern of globalization. My recommendation is you make a note of that definition. So you might want to pause this now, but I'll move on because you'll catch up to me. And I introduce you simply to the notion of there being trade barriers, because I mentioned it earlier, trade barriers which are not the same as they used to be, because we're saying that there are great advantages to doing business with whomever you want, whenever you want, because it doesn't make you dependent upon anyone. And that becomes an issue, is trying to reduce dependency. The case is also that with Google Translate and with dictionaries and with interpreters, there is no jurisdiction in the world which is actually beyond us. We can overcome language and cultural barriers and do business where we want, when we want. So those lowered trade barriers are not all good, while South Africa will ask its export partners to lower their trade barriers. And for example, we'd say to Germany, please, can you guys lower your trade barriers so that we can find it easier to sell South African goods to you. The reverse is also requested. And when we have a need for particular things, so for example, we have a need for stainless steel, and we don't make all of it ourselves, we import it. Trouble is, we're importing stainless steel, which is made from steel and chrome. We're importing it from people that we sell our chrome to. And we have to buy a lot of steel, and they just buy a little bit of chrome, because their little bit of chrome, which makes us export revenue, their little bit of chrome is very much less than the amount of iron that we give them in order to make stainless steel for us. So we're on the losing side of the bargain. I think we should probably contemplate that that's about as much as we should try and cover with you. I'm going to say that there are certain things which are important. We mustn't lose sight in all this notion of pest and trade barriers and divestment. We should rather keep our eye on the ball. And the ball is that there are opportunities and there are threats. You take advantage of the opportunities and you try and sidestep the threats, because that's what's going to hurt you real bad. And that's the way business works, and that's all there is to it. Thank you for joining me.